Hello, and thanks for clicking on the video. In this video, I make another step towards completing my book Nook diorama project. In the previous parts, I painted a beholder and some characters for the scene, but this time, it's all about the scenery. I'm going to paint this big archway, some rocky stalactites, and some little bits made up of mostly candles and books. My idea for these candle and book pieces was to use them on the stairs of the bigger piece of terrain, and to lay them around as if they're part of some kind of summoning ritual. So something that will look a little bit like this on the screen now. To get started, I needed to put a layer of primer all over the terrain. And at this point, I also want to introduce you to two new pieces that you won't have seen in the previous video. I bought these two rocky pieces because I was concerned about the boring roof of my diorama. I really didn't want it to be plain and boring up there, so on the roof I want to have these pieces as stalactites hanging down from the ceiling. They should help frame the diorama and stop the awkward top part where there'll be a gap between this archway and the top of the book nook. To get started with my painting, I took this dark grey from scale 75 and I started to apply it all over my terrain piece. I used the biggest brush I could find, and for a big piece of terrain like this, I recommend you always do your base coats with the biggest brush you have. Alright, maybe not a ginormous, enormous paintbrush, but a pretty big brush will help you here, speed up the process. After I'd applied a whole layer of this to the steps and the arch, I wanted to mix up a really nice dark brown to base coat all of the rocks on the sides of the stairs. Any desaturated dark brown would work for this, but I used a mix of my Eclipse grey that I used for the stonework, with Gobi brown and Dubai brown, also from scale 75. When I was happy with the dark brown that I'd mixed up, I just applied it all over the rocks, everywhere with a big brush. Because I was applying this over a black, I had to do two coats, so I got an opaque layer. With the base coats down on these two main parts, it was now time for me to highlight. So I grabbed these three paints you can see from the Army Painter, and I began to start dry brushing the darkest of those greys over the base coat. I did some research on dry brushing before this video, and I realised a lot of people use a dampening pad and I didn't really have one. So the bright pink sponge that you can see behind my hand here on the screen is my makeshift dampening pad. I added a tiny bit of water to it with the back end of the brush, and then I used it to try and have a bit of moisture in the bristles. I don't really know if I did it right or if it really worked that well. It's something I still have to practice, but I was quite happy with how the dry brushing came out, so we'll call it a win. For my next layer, I was using Ash Grey, which is 2 jumps brighter in the Hexad system that the Army Painter has for these greys. I chose 2 jumps brighter because I wanted there to be a nice popping contrast. And for the first layer, I dry brushed and stippled quite a lot, covering most of the base coat, but for this layer, I wanted to cover slightly less, so I used a bit less pressure and I didn't stipple quite as much. For the third layer, I used Brigade Grey, which is another 2 jumps brighter. And this is a really light grey, so I wanted it only on the most prominent edges. So I did a really soft dry brushing here. The stairs needed the same treatment as the arch, so I got to work doing the exact same thing on the stairs. With the stairs now matching the arch, it's time to do the rocks, and it's the same principle, but with different colours here. To help my rocks stand out from the stonework, I wanted my rocks to be a brown grey. And 2 good paints I had for this were from the AK 3rd Gen range. They're called Grey Brown and Rock Grey. I first dry brushed grey brown all over all the tops of the rocks, and I stippled a lot of the tops of the rocks too to try and avoid picking up any of the texture from this print. I then went for a 50-50 mix of grey brown and rock grey to dry brush my next layer. Once again focusing this on the top of the rocks in a smaller area than the previous layer. And then for a final layer with the dry brush at least, I did pure rock grey. I stippled this and lightly dry brushed this just over the very top peaks. This piece has a load of twisty old roots growing out of the stone, so I wanted to paint those next, so I covered those in a nice layer of dark brown. I think the brown I used for this was Brigandine Brown from the Army Painter Fanatic range. So with the roots base coated, this is what it looked like. Now I'm going to use these lighter browns from the Army Painter Fanatic and maybe a bit of warm grey for an extra added bit of brightness. And I'm just going to work up through those colours, adding layers as I go, covering less with each layer. I think of this like painting in between the lines. You just make sure you paint less than what you painted before, so a little bit of the previous layer is still visible on the edges of the new layer. I went for desaturated greyish browns as highlights on these roots because I wanted them to look old. And I thought if it was more saturated and bright orangey browns, it would make the wood look far more vibrant and alive. And this is going to be down in a dark cave, so these roots are long dead. And with that all finished, here's what they look like when they were done. To finish up this bit of terrain, there were a few small details I still had to fix. One of those was painting all of the rocky parts that had spilled onto the stone. These are little bits of debris and rocks that just add more character and break up all of the continuous grey on the steps. I painted them with the exact same paint colours as I did the rocks next to them, except this time I just added these paints with a normal brush instead of a dry brush. While I had the brush out, I thought I could do one extra layer of highlighting on the very edges of the rock. So this is where that warm grey that I showed comes in. I'm using that here to add a really fine edge highlight to some of the more prominent edges of the rock that are facing the viewer and the light. So here's what the archway piece now looks like, now that it's done. My next task was to paint the two small stalactite pieces. Because they're also rocks and they're meant to be part of the same cave, I wanted to paint these in the exact same way as I did the rocks next to the stairs. I laid down the dark brown base coat with a brush and did all of the rest of the layers with a dry brush, same as the rocks before. One step that I did here with the brush that I also did on the big terrain piece was adding back in some grey brown to give me some more distinct colours in my midtones. I hope that this would give me more colour variation and make the rocks look slightly more interesting. When that was finished, the last thing to do was to make sure all the rock pieces matched. And they did, and this is what they look like together. I'm now going to move on to the tiny bits with the candles and the books. And here are some of the paints I was thinking about using: reds, blues, browns and greens. These will be for the books, and so I begin to paint those in their different colours, choosing different books at random and applying a different colour to it. Some books I chose to paint green, some books I chose to paint red, some books I painted with the blue, and then a few of the books I painted in a more classical kind of brown. As these books were pretty small details and there's going to be a lot going on with this diorama, I didn't worry too much about loads of layers of highlights, so each one of these books just got one layer of highlight. That meant choosing one significantly brighter colour of the same sort of hue and adding it over the top of the edges. chose bone white and barbarian skin to paint the book pages. Barbarian skin was the base coat, a slightly darker creamy brown, and I applied a few layers of that over the black primer until I had an opaque base coat. I didn't do any mixes for this one, I just went straight to the bone white and began to apply it over the pages. I also used it as an edge highlight for the edges of pages on any books that were closed, or any bits where little page edges were sticking out below others. I wanted my books to be filled with various different bits of writing and diagrams or drawings, so I had a lot of fun just playing around with different designs and patterns that I could use. I wanted this to look okay at a glance, but I didn't do loads of detail on this because these parts are really just a small bit of the diorama and aren't really a massive focal point, so I didn't worry too much about making these perfect. I did have some fun with the variations though. One of these books is like a crazy mess of writing. One of them has these big red symbols in it. One is more of a normal writing book and the other has some diagrams. There were some other small details like bottles on this bigger piece. I painted one of those blue and I painted the other one purple. For now, I did very basic highlights on them. I don't know exactly how the light's going to work in my scene and how much these are going to be visible, so I didn't go crazy on this yet, but I will, before the end of the diorama, check these, and if they're looking a bit undetailed compared to everything else, I'll fix them up at the end. I should be able to get my brush into the nook just enough to be able to do a bit of work on these if I have to. And there was also a crystal ball that I quickly covered with a grey. I didn't try and do any fancy reflection or magic effects on it, because once again, it's not that important within the scene. For a tiny bit of depth though, I did put a blue ink around the bottom, and then I did just cover the base in some grey with a quick highlight. The next thing I had to paint was some skulls that were on top of some of the book pieces, and with some of the candles. I wanted to use the bone white paint again because it's perfect for this kind of thing, but I wanted to start from a different base tone so it didn't look the same as the pages. I used Brigandine Brown from the Army Painter for this because it's a nice desaturated dark brown. I used a 50-50 mix of my bone white and my Brigandine Brown as an intermediate highlight, and then I used bone white for a final highlight all around the most prominent areas and the top of the skulls. With the skulls painted, it was time to move on to the candles, which is the last big element of these small parts. I decided to cover the black primer with beige from Vallejo Model Color. This took me quite a few coats to get this opaque over the black, but once it was opaque, I could move on to doing the flames. And these were the 3 paints that I used for that from the Army Painter. I started by covering all the flames in Inner Light, which is the brightest yellow of this group. And then I imagined my candle as thirds, and for the top 2 thirds, I then added Flickering Flame, and for the final top third, I added Burning Ore. Here are all the candle pieces laid out so you can see them. Also, I painted the top of the wax on every candle yellow so that it looked like there was light glowing from the flame. So having painted everything I wanted to paint this week, let's have a look at how I'm going to put this all together. The big archway piece is going to go about 2/3 to the back of the book nook as I showed in the last video, but now it's painted. On top of that, like I showed at the beginning, I'm going to arrange all of these various bits of books and candles all over the different parts of the scene. With With those bits in place, you can start to see what the scene's going to look like. So here are some slow panning shots so you can take it all in. To get an even better idea, I wanted to put the side and the top on, as that would allow me to show the stalactites that I painted earlier in the video. And with those on and my lamp adjusted slightly, this is another look at the book nook as it stands here at the end of part 3. So obviously the sides of the book nook, the top and the bottom, they're all a bit boring right now, and I need to make them way more exciting, which is what I'm going to do in part 4. With a project like this, I'm not really sure how it's all going to go when it comes together, so I'm going to reserve the right in the next video to change colours or things that I might need to change, might need to make everything darker or something like that. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you're as excited as I am to see this project finished. And if you are, I hope you'll join me in the next video.